Alright guys, today we're going to be talking about determining properties of rational functions. So to the right, I have the basic equation of a rational function, and to the left here, I have a particular rational function that they want us to determine the properties of. So when they're asking to find the properties, what they're essentially asking for is the domain, range, and asymptotes. Okay? So we're going to start out by finding first the domain and range of this particular rational function. Okay, and this is fairly simple, so let's go through the process. So we're going to have the following: domain, okay, and range. So this is pretty easy. Okay, so the domain is always going to be your h value. So if I look at my basic equation of a rational function, here's my h. Well, what is that value when we look at our function in question, right? It looks like I have a -3 there. So what did I have to plug into h in order to get -3 here? Well, I would have had to plug in a +3, right? So our domain here is going to be all real numbers, except my h value, what we determined, was going to be +3. Okay. Now for my range, it's going to be your k value. So here's my k, and here it is with the function in question. So for my range, it's going to be all real numbers, except y cannot be equal to, and my k value here is going to be -5. Okay. So we just determined both the domain and the range of this particular rational function. Now we want to go ahead and graph this rational function, and in order to graph it, we need to first find the asymptotes. Okay, so let's go ahead and make our graph, and again, this doesn't have to be perfect, so we're just going to go ahead and do this fairly quick. Okay, so there's our graph. And before we go ahead and graph this by hand, we first want to determine or put on the vertical and horizontal asymptotes on this graph. Okay, and that will make the whole graphing process much easier. Okay, especially when you're doing it by hand and you don't have a graphing calculator. Okay, so the first step is to always put your vertical and horizontal asymptotes on the graph. All right, and this is again pretty easy to understand. Your vertical asymptote is always going to be what you got for your domain. So in this case, we got x cannot equal +3. So what I'm going to do here, and we'll do this in a different color, at x at +3, so 1, 2, 3, we're going to make a vertical dashed line. So a vertical dashed line, okay? So the domain coincides with the vertical asymptote, all right? Likewise, the range is going to coincide with the horizontal asymptote, and that is going to occur at -5. We're going to go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and we're going to draw our horizontal asymptote. All right, our next step here is to go ahead and graph this rational function by hand. And before we do that, we're going to have to pick some x values here so we can kind of determine what's going on, okay, with our rational function. We know it has to respect both these vertical and horizontal asymptotes, okay, but we're not really sure of which direction it's going in. So we're going to have to pick some values for x here so we can go ahead and determine that. So I'm just going to pick an arbitrary x value here. I'm just going to pick -5. Okay, so I'm going to plug in a -5 for x, and I'm going to determine what my y value will be. Okay, and if you want, if you have a calculator, you can go ahead and do this. So I'm going to plug in a -5 here. Okay, so if I do -5 and a -3, that's going to make -8, right? So I'll go ahead and write it on the bottom here. So we're going to plug in a -5 and determine -5, and a -3 make it -8, and then I have -5. Okay, so I have -1/8, right? So -1/8. So let's go ahead and do this on our calculator. So -1/8. And again, if you had a graphing calculator, you could always just graph it and then you could go ahead and sketch it in, but if you want to do it by hand, you can do it like this as well. Alright. And we get negative 5.125. So, when we plugged in negative 5, we got the following, negative 5.125. Okay, so remember, our horizontal asymptote is occurring at negative 5, and that point is right below it. So knowing that, right, if we go over negative 5, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we're down here somewhere, right below this negative 5, we already know, okay, this side of the graph, right, because we have our asymptotes drawn in here, so we can go ahead now and just simply, okay, we know it has to respect these asymptotes, so we have to make sure it fits in this little section here, right, so we'll have the following. That's it. And that's why we always go ahead and graph both our asymptotes on the graph beforehand, because again, it makes the graphing process much easier. Alright, let's determine on this side now. So again, I'm just going to pick an arbitrary value. I'll just pick 4 here. Alright, let's see what happens at 4. So if I plug a 4 in here, what happens? So I'll get 1 over 4 minus 3, which is just going to be 1 over 1, which is 1, right? So I have 1 minus 5. Well, this is going to be negative 4, right? Negative 4. So at 4, so 1, 2, 3, 4, right? I'm down negative 4, right above, right, this negative 5. So again, I have my basic shape, right? Because I'm just going to go ahead and respect those asymptotes now. And that will have the following. Right? And that's it. Alright, so that is how you go about determining the properties of rational functions.